Welcome, everyone. Like you said, I'm the managing director of the Global Philanthropy Forum, and we are actually housed here in this building. We are a project of World Affairs that was started about 25 years ago, and the vision was to direct, at that time, new tech money into international philanthropic investments. So coming out of the 90s, as development was growing, this was sort of a growing sector, and we had the privilege of sort of grabbing the zeitgeist moment as conveners to bring together those who are really interested in that kind of work. So I've continued that through the last couple decades, and now sit here in this building, and actually is a fun little a piece of history. My great-great-grandfather is the founding president of the Commonwealth Club. So this is a bit of a legacy piece for me to be here, which is a real privilege. And I am thrilled to be hosting this conversation, which is both timely and really important. So we are here to chat about humanitarian funding disruption, but also innovation and reform, what's needed next. So as we talk about what the challenges are, I wanted to kick us off with who are our speakers and what they bring to this conversation. So first we have Yanti Sarepto, President and CEO of Save the Children US. So Yanti leads Save the Children, one of the world's largest children-focused humanitarian organizations, and is managing one of the most disruptive funding environments we've ever seen. More on that later, I'm sure. Recently named a Forbes 50 over 50 list, she brings decades of global leadership across both corporate and humanitarian sectors, and is a powerful voice for reform in how we fund and deliver aid. Next, we have Fred Kaner, Managing Director at DAF Giving 360. So Fred leads strategy and partnerships at DAF Giving 360, helping unlock the power of donor-advised funds to drive charitable impact. And we'll get more into what that is in this session. With over 25 years of experience in financial services, Fred has built a nationally recognized platform for agile and advisor-led philanthropy. And then we have Caitlin Tulloch, who is co-founder of Project Resource Mobilization and senior director at Give Directly. So Caitlin's a leading voice in cost effectiveness and evidence-based humanitarian finance. As a former economist at USAID, RIP, she helped shape over $1 billion in program commitments. Now through Pro and Give Directly, she bridges institutional and private first funding models, guiding donors towards high-impact, locally led solutions. So to kick us off, Yanti, I want to turn to you. So respond, rebound, reform has been a guiding philosophy for you in light of the foreign aid cuts. Can you share how this approach is shaping Save the Children's fundraising and operational strategy?
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. I keep saying to people now, this is month 9 of this year, right? And it feels like 9 years, but it is really only 9 months. We're starting to stop talking about what happened. We're starting really to focus on what we do next and what are we doing in this current climate. So I think, and that does bring a certain amount of energy and I don't know, bloody-mindedness and determination, I think, to all those conversations and to our staff in particular, but also to our funders. And we see that more and more reflected now in these conversations. So, but just to get back to what did happen, we lost 30% of our funding. We let go of over 300,000 staff worldwide across 45 countries, mostly in the countries where, of course, there was very little by way of other social protection infrastructure at all. We talk about midwives and doctors and nurses, and also finance managers and HR managers across all these countries. So that is what we did and what we had to do. We also really tried desperately, and I'm sure Caitlin will talk about this because they helped with that. We tried to keep some of our immediate life-saving work alive, literally, by finding alternative funds, by working with amazing philanthropists, essentially, that said, okay, we'll jump in to this gap to help you continue the work so that at least on this particular moment, kids are not dying completely unnecessarily because we know exactly what works, we know what we're doing it, and now you ask us to tell these parents that we're closing this clinic or this school or whatever. So, but we still closed a bunch of those things, right? Our work in Afghanistan has zero funding from the US government, DRC, the list is long. Now we're really looking at, okay, how do we remake ourselves, right? Our founder Eglantine Jebb said it 100 years ago. Every time there is a conflict, a war, mankind has the opportunity to rebuild this ruin of our world, and she founded it on the back of World War One. So it is an opportune moment, and it is really looking at sometimes our work differently. We knew the system wasn't perfect, right? So rebounding, using data and technology more deliberately, using cash much more at scale. I'm sure you'll talk a little bit about that. Thinking harder about the interventions that we know work, where there is ample evidence, cost effectiveness data. When you put this in, if you compare to this, what is better? Not just in the moment, but also over time. Those things were never incentivized in the system because donors were funding their own thing. Right, without actually looking at what else is out there, what should we build on, right? This was an incredibly imperfect market. So now is that time where we have to be much more hard-nosed. It was a terrible way to be forced to do it like that. I wish it hadn't happened, but since it happened, we better make sure we make the most out of it.
Yeah, it's very powerful. I heard there's something that someone said during UN General Assembly recently that has been sticking with me that makes me think of what you just mentioned, is that the real risk for this moment in the sector is a failure of coordination. That actually is a pretty critical part of this particular moment. And I have a feeling that's going to come up a little bit, especially as I turn to Caitlin. So Caitlin, having worked with USAID, you were part of the funding before, so the before times, and now we're leading on private first funding initiatives, and you're part now of the after, if we're going to start defining things that way, as we probably should. What shifts and trends have you observed in how priorities are set, are risks managed, and the impact is measured between institutional and private philanthropic models?
It's a great question, and I feel like I have a very long trajectory view on this because I was actually only in government for about 2 years, although this year has lasted about 9 years, as you say. Prior to that, I also worked at an organization much like Save the Children, with a mixture of private and institutional money to implement humanitarian programs. We learned a lot in that period of time. I was with this organization. I was with the International Rescue Committee for about 8 years, and we focused a lot, exactly as Janti has said, on how do we optimize for cost effectiveness. And at a certain point became very frustrated and said, there's something that could be improved in the way funding comes to us from the biggest institutional donors. And it was at that point that I did make the decision to join USAID. And I did the cost benefit in my mind of I really love where I work. But also USAID spends $35 billion a year. And if you can make some portion of that better and more outcomes focused, then that's worth whatever has just happened, which I still think. I think my observation is that institutional funding, there are many cons, there are many things that we've all historically griped about. It is slow. It is often pulled in many, many directions. When you look at the number of congressional earmarks and directives that were layered onto USAID, FCDO has similar things in their relationship to their parliament. The decisions can be really politically as well as technically driven. And so you're optimizing for a lot more things. And that results, I think, often in programming that could feel kind of scattershot, really trying to do so many things at once. The pros, though, I think the upshot and where, institutional funding continues to have some unique value is in the predictability. You knew to a greater or lesser extent, USAID was going to continue to fund humanitarian response in this country year on year. And it was going to take a lot of work and a lot of people agreeing to change that. And that was pretty important in the delivery. And the other thing that I think was quite unique about institutional funding of that size and scale was exactly what I just said, scale. The opportunity to do things that are fundamentally an order of magnitude larger than what most private philanthropy can imagine doing. And that's not just more of the same stacked on top of each other. What you sometimes get when you're working at that scale is an opportunity to think about the systems that are underlying your delivery. And could you make, all of humanitarian response more effective if, the health services that you're working with and through were a little bit better? And so I think where we're at in this moment is we've been kind of yanked away from the level of coordination and the level of scale that kind of long-term humanitarian funding has given us. And I do think that one of the primary risks is, for all that it was a huge, huge pain to have to sit in as many meetings as I did and talk to as many people to get a decision made, that aspect of coordination is really valuable. And so I think the challenge of this moment for private philanthropy is to get some of the kind of muscle memory that, governments working with human agencies have historically had to say, who else is doing what? Where do we fit in? What is the long-term plan for this? And use that as the backbone for a really efficient, ideally, and outcomes-focused response.
Thanks, Caitlin. I know one of the challenges of this transition is the knowledge loss, not just capital. And that is a much harder one to retain. So noting that in the coordination challenge now where we find ourselves. So turning to you, Fred. So Caitlin is bringing this insight from the institutional funding space, and you're working closely with individual donors. Let's dive into what donor-advised funds are and what sort of innovative finance models can be found there for humanitarian work. So just context for the audience, DAFs are growing. And so I want you also to talk a bit about what those numbers look like, sort of what the trajectory is for DAFs as well.
Sure. And, I'm so heartened to hear the stories both from you, Nancy, and from you about, the challenges that we're meeting of late, and the way that you are so in such an inspiring way, sort of, okay, it happened, as you say, now what do we do to pick up sort of the pieces and move on? And it's really remarkable what you've done in the face of some incredible adversity. So thank you, guys. So a donor-advised fund, I'm with DAF Giving 360. We're a donor-advised fund that's been in existence since 1999. And at its basic level, a donor-advised fund is an account for giving. And what that means is donors contribute to the account whatever they choose. It could be cash, it could be stock, it could be real estate, collectibles, private business interests, and so forth. They contribute those assets to us, to the donor-advised fund. We liquidate those assets on their behalf. Then the assets are invested in the account hopefully for growth, until which time the donor is prepared to, recommend a grant to the charity or the cause that they choose to support. So it's a very straightforward, highly efficient, tax smart process of really helping donors to maximize their charitable impact. And we are a nonprofit, meaning we are, once those donors have made a contribution to a donor-advised fund account, it qualifies for an immediate tax deduction, which makes it that much easier for them to grow the assets over time that they want to ultimately grant out for both their short and their long-term philanthropic goals. And so we are seeing now more than ever, when I listen to both of you talk, we see a heightened opportunity for us to find out, how do we activate these accounts? How do we activate these donors who are all incredibly philanthropically minded, but just need a bit of not a nudge, I don't want to say that, just a bit of a, what's the word? Encouragement. to really, right, in order to just sort of activate that generosity. It's a remarkable thing to see how much people give and where, but they also want guidance on where the needs are greatest and how to define and narrow their areas of interest in a way that is going to really resonate with them and their personal goals, philanthropically speaking, those of their families, and ultimately identify the charities such as Save the Children, which they want to choose to support. And we provide that consultative guidance to these donors in a more proactive way now more than ever before, because now the need is so much more critical and exponential. And we do it in a way where, we're here as a resource to them. We want them to know that we're not just the account, but we are a resource for them to understand how to contribute the best assets that ultimately will lead to the most significant charitable impact. How to invest those assets in the account, which with a process that aligns with their personal goals from an investments perspective. And finally, their granting strategy. What do they want to support beyond their house of worship, their alma mater? What is their short and long-term goal? And how can we help to sort of make the connection between the remarkable nonprofits that are supported through our solution and their goals and objectives? And that's what we're really doing now, more than ever before. We're playing that deeply consultative role in such a way where we're trying to make sure these people feel the impact that they have and have the opportunity to really understand it at a deeper level.
Very helpful. Thank you, Fred.
Sure.
So for context, for the audience, so we've got over 250 billion in charitable funding in the U.S. alone is held inside of DAFs, just to give you a context for how much capital is held in this kind of vehicle.
That's right.
That it has been on a really pretty rapid growth trajectory, particularly in the last decade, which I think is something that a lot of people don't necessarily understand from a mechanism perspective, and what that then now means in this moment, because those assets can all be deployed at this moment. But they need encouragement
Yeah.
for
And
that.
could
to
I just
happen.
add one little
Yeah.
thing to that? If I may, you reminded me. That's very true. And they have the opportunity to act in the moment right now because they have the capital already set aside for charitable use. It's in the account growing. It's already effectively been donated to a nonprofit. So now what the opportunity is, give some real thought to the acute need, the significant need that we are all facing today, and the best and most efficient way to support it. We just granted, since our inception, which was in 1999, we've granted $44 billion to charity. We have, actually, no, I take it back. That's even grown since, but I'll go with that for now. We have, just this past fiscal year alone, we granted $8.9 billion to charity, which is an extraordinary amount. And that suggests to me that the opportunity is immense, and the opportunity not only for activating our solution, but for really engaging our donors in a way that can really provide material benefit to organizations that so desperately need it right now. Sorry, just wanted to add that.
No, that's great. That's very helpful and encouraging to hear.
Yeah.
I know there's a wide range in terms of those numbers when it comes to DAFs being deployed. And I think that's one of the challenging parts of the conversation is that there can be statistics that are applied across the space, which are not ones you want to look at because they're a little bit depressing. And then there are those that, when you drill down into it, they're really actively giving DAFs, which is the model we hope to see across the board. So how to really learn from that, and hearing that you're seeing that uptick is with the kind of space we want to, platform more and hear more about what is activating people, what's getting that ambition there, and how are they helping, or how are you helping them overcome the barriers to that activation, which I think we will get more into.
You bet.
Okay, so turning back over to you, Yanti, I want to hear about how organizations like Save the Children are tapping into innovative finance at this time, which you kind of mentioned at the beginning, and specifically this private first funding for humanitarian response, and what innovations are needed to make these mechanisms more agile and locally responsive.
Yeah, and I think, look, we started to look at that a few years back already, and now is also really the time to scale it up. We have said to ourselves, we need to go private first. We are not putting any chips on a return of U.S. government funding, certainly not in the way that it was, notwithstanding the benefits and the real effectiveness of it. But we're not. That's not a way to plan fiscally, certainly not for the foreseeable future. So that's a done deal. So how do we then get back to what we had, but also to do what? And I think that is where you have to start, right? Save the Children has a broad, it's great. We work for children's rights. The downside is that a lot of things can fall under that umbrella, right? And then you get not so much mission creep, but you just, if you're not careful, you become, miles wide and an inch deep, as they say. Yeah. So this moment prompts us to go much more strictly to go, okay, what has the most impact for kids? What are we uniquely good at? And now you have to be really honest. We're not good at everything, so let's be honest. What are we good at? What is MSF better at? What is IRC better at? What is Give Directly better at? So that is quite an honest and robust conversation we're having now with colleagues in the sector, which, this sector was never good at consolidation, joint ventures, etc. We all love each other, we talk a lot, but we don't do deals, right? Because there was never an incentive. Whereas in the private sector, it's the opposite. You don't really like each other, but you will do a deal, right? So, so that's what we're doing. So that's one. So I'm excited about that. Innovative financing we're seeing. We see a step up of philanthropy. We also set up a global ventures team 5 years ago that is really looking at impact investing, but also has a multiplier fund where you essentially say to philanthropists, this is a grant mechanism, but we're using it to invest either in debt or equity into mostly social enterprises, mostly from the countries where the issues are, because we feel they are actually unlocking an innovative solution to something that is, that has eluded us, right? So we're essentially, you're trying to crowd in innovation by taking often quite a minor financial stake in them or a debt position. There are often bigger funders in that space, but they like us because we can actually give them content input on the work that we're doing. So an ed tech company, a wonderful company that essentially has come up with pediatric diagnostics for community healthcare workers, which are often not highly educated, but it essentially helps them diagnose if the child has pneumonia, because we also know that the lack of diagnosis leads to a lot of unnecessary death. So, and it's been randomized control trials to the end, and we've invested in. Now, getting those companies off the ground at scale is hard work. Any startup founder knows that, again, here 70% fails, or maybe the number is higher. So we have a portfolio of these companies. We are very clear that a lot of them will not work at scale or will fail for all kinds of reasons, good reasons, bad reasons. But we feel it helps us to say to people, this is a different way of impact, of helping us be better. And this is a way to crowd that in. So that's the innovative piece. Will that replace the $350 million that we lost per year, right? No, not immediately. I do think we're now close to launching our fund for education in Africa, mostly early education for kids in Africa. We've signed up essentially an underwriting funder, and I think we'll launch it at $100 million. So that is not immaterial.
Yeah.
When you really can pump $100 million into helping low-cost early childhood development centers and scale it up. It doesn't get to the poorest of the poor, right? Because these are still fee-paying local solutions. That's how the model works. But it does give another capacity. It builds capacity in those countries for a whole host of children who currently, even if their parents are able to pay a little bit, and we're talking, singular dollars here per month, they still don't have access to quality care or education in this sense. So again, unlocking all of that private capital that Fred just talked about, it's not just the DAFs, it's also in the DFI, in the development banks, in the development financial institutions, in private wealth family offices. Yeah. There's 9,000 of them, and I think there's $5 trillion in family offices. So there is so much money, and it's growing. So to unlock some of that capital for the right things for children, I think is what really excites us in this moment.
Yeah, you start getting down that road of all the different mechanisms. It's a very nerdy conversation that we can have at a different time. But I think you gave us a really good overview of that, Jantu. One of the ones that can be really exciting, but does get a little bit dry is the debt one. But there's a lot there. So kicking back over to you, Caitlin, with these innovative financing mechanisms, especially those familiar with tech and finance in this community we have here in the Bay Area, can it be leveraged for long-term humanitarian impact?
Yeah. And I'll say I'm especially happy to be here tonight. I'm actually a Bay Area native. I'm very proud. I tell people my daughter is now I think she's 6th generation Californian. Which
That's me. I'm a 6th generation. So
cool. Okay.
That's great. I'm glad to hear that.
One more generation, we've made it.
Perfect.
My great-grandfather founded and my grandfather ran a construction company for many years, and they did a lot of philanthropic giving. Actually, one of the displays at Fairyland in Oakland was donated.
Oh, wow.
Which I'm also,
that's great.
Yeah, very proud of. And I remember when I was little at one point, my grandfather talking to me about philanthropic giving, and he was saying, yes, I donate to Oxfam because 80 cents of every dollar that they take in goes to programs, and that's how you know it's good. And for context, my grandfather was an engineer, seismic engineer. He was not a social sector guy. He was not an economist. Very smart man. But a lot of my career has been figuring out, is that really the right metric to think about? And I think the way that we talk about efficiency or cost effectiveness in the philanthropic space has always taken the unit of analysis as the organization. Oxfam is good because their percentage is X, and so is bad if it's X plus 2 cents. From the time I spent, working at MIT, kind of working on cost effectiveness analysis, nobody thinks about assessing cost effectiveness in that way. What you have to look at is the specific programs, what we would usually call the specific interventions that are being delivered. And as Yanti said, for an organization like Save the Children, that can be a massively broad spectrum. It was the same for International Rescue Committee. Some organizations are much more specialized, others are very broad. But you can't really talk meaningfully about cost effectiveness of an organization. No. And I think the place where cost effectiveness, this lens, can be a catalyst for private funding is where it's done a good enough job, as you say, over the last 2 decades of impact evaluations and of the publication of research that says, okay, how much does it cost to deliver malnutrition treatment here versus here versus here, if we use this or that protocol, where we've actually figured out to a very great extent, there's a set of interventions, of things we can do that are just known from very, very high caliber research to deliver impact on the specific outcomes that we're seeking to achieve. There's very few things that solve all of development. I guess if there were, we probably wouldn't have to be here in this room. So the challenge often is about saying, what is the outcome that I'm interested in? Because the thing that is cost effective for children's early literacy is probably going to be a different thing than what's cost effective for poverty alleviation. But when you're clear about what the desired outcome is, cost effectiveness information, I think it helps you make comparisons so that people feel confident that they're actually optimizing for the specific thing that they care about. And the other thing it can do that I think has been really powerful this year is make the costs of inaction pretty painfully clear. Yeah. I spent with several of my colleagues much of this year combing through the canceled USAID projects to say, if I thought we could mobilize, I don't know, probably 20 million when we started, what would you put it towards? And you do the math on some of these things, and what you're able to say with a very, unfortunately, straight face is that, for every $2,500 put into this program, one child doesn't have to die. And I can send you the citations for that, and I can send you the spreadsheets for that. But ultimately, I think what cost effectiveness is about is really illustrating to people what the stakes are of where they choose to put their money and whether they choose to make those investments or not. That's, maybe a little bit of the dry, nerdy stuff, but I think hopefully with the human kind of impact clear. What I hope in terms of the financing angle is that we can use this skeleton of an understanding of cost effectiveness and say, okay, if what we're worried about is wasting, children who are acutely malnourished, usually in crisis situations, and there is a known set of interventions that are just massively, massively cost effective. The US government has changed its mind 2 or 3 times this year, how it feels about putting funding into those things, which is really hard because that has very real consequences in very real time. There are similarly, very well evidenced approaches for early childhood development. The organization I work for now does large lump sum cash transfers, which have a massive body of cost effectiveness evidence to show they work really well for poverty alleviation. And what I would love to see is where kind of the donor community, the philanthropic community, can be clear in coordination, not necessarily in every individual thing they're doing, but in what are the highest priority outcomes to achieve. That becomes an organizing principle to say, okay, well, these are the programs that we cannot let fail. These are the programs we cannot not have in the world. And I would say in some sense, many people used to fund those kinds of programs through their taxes. They may or may not have known it, but I think it's interesting when you talk about people, they're going to donate to their alma mater or to their house of worship or whatever. That used to be giving that was done alongside the giving that USAID did that you never had to think about. And I think we're now in a moment where those who have the means to be giving at a really great scale are going to have to, unfortunately, but take some of that work onto themselves that government was doing to say, okay, what are the large-scale humanitarian response systems? What is the HIV prevention and treatment that I don't want to live in a world that doesn't have those things. And that can become an organizing principle then for my giving.
Yeah, very powerful. That gets us back to the definition of philanthropy, which is for humanity, which has to be reminded. But what you're also talking about is narrative, both the narrative in terms of how do we measure impact and the narrative of how do we figure out what is most important and drive towards that in a coordinated effort and organization, which takes time. And when we come back to those percentages, then, that role is often left out as like an understanding of effectiveness, that actually coordination is a really important part of effectiveness, but is not sometimes considered programmatic. Again, we're getting into the nerdy weeds of these pieces of the space. So I want to go back over to you, Fred. And as drafts are continuing to grow in popularity, as we mentioned, curious, how can we better align donor intent with urgent humanitarian needs, especially when it comes to funding locally led, evidence-based interventions?
It's a great question. Education, awareness, messaging. The more we can do to remind donors of the immediacy of need across the globe in a manner that is consistent with their charitable intent, the more active they tend to typically be. And, what you just said is very, very interesting, that, we really, for many of the highly resourced philanthropists out there, the government more or less took it over for them. They didn't really have to make those calls. They didn't really have to be so intentional about how they give, what they give, when, where, because much of it was already handled for them. And now it has to be a more intentional exercise, and it has to be a more thoughtful exercise. And we're trying to help with that education. We've built, for example, what we call our charitable giving guide, which is a structured process whereby it helps a donor think through at a very detailed level exactly what their strategic giving plan is meant to be. What do they want to give? What are the causes they want to support? Where? How do they want to give? How do they define their charitable intent? There's multiple areas of input, and it provides, when they've done that, it provides them with the philanthropic plan on how to be as thoughtful as possible and where to consider giving their significant amounts to achieve the best results and to have the highest impact. So to answer your question, I think that the more we can do to educate and activate those donors in whatever way possible, if it's reminding them of the acute need that we're facing as disasters strike, for example, humanitarian crises, natural disasters, in floods in Texas, fires in California, and so forth. We have to remind them to be active. We have to remind them to be engaged, and we have to remind them to really do whatever they can and then some to utilize those resources in the most efficient possible way. And I just have to say one thing in closing. When Yanti was talking about the various opportunities for philanthropy to supplement what we have otherwise lost, she mentioned the thing about family offices and $5 trillion. Did you notice that she looked at me as if to say, "Get on this, Fred"? I
subconsciously, maybe.
Subconsciously,
Well,
but
I'd love to jump in there because I realized that I didn't actually tell the good end part of my story.
Oh,
In
good.
the earlier part this year,
Yeah.
as I was fired multiple times, we started working with Save the Children, with others on, kind of putting together these numbers about, for this much money, if you support a program in Sudan and Nigeria. I think when we started, I made a bet with a friend that maybe we'll get to about $25 million mobilized. And through an exceptional, however many months it's been, in the end, it's been about $120 million that has
To
been
date.
directed
Yes.
to date.
Exactly.
And that is because people stepped up. And I think there is something in this moment. And one of the bright sides of this really terrible year has been meeting people who would call and be like, "Hey, I have $500,000. I got a call from somebody's grandma. It was like, I have $500,000 in a DAF. Tell me what's on your list."
yeah,
Yep.
It was wonderful. It was really makes you believe in humanity after some.
Well,
some
Yanti, can I tell the story?
Yeah,
that you
yeah,
just
go
told me?
ahead. This was amazing.
This is an amazing thing. She said she was meeting with a donor, and or philanthropists here in the Bay Area,
New donor.
a new donor, and this donor engaged with you. I don't want to take your words, but effectively, she got a significant gift just for reminding this donor that they have a donor advised fund, they have the assets already available for charitable intent, and they made a sizable grant.
Sizable gift, and because they found the Piro website.
Oh.
Now that's
Wow, look at this.
And then she went like, "I was so mad. I needed to do something." I looked at my DAF. All of a sudden, realized, a lot of money. It has, it has grown. And then she looked at the PRO website and she made 2 gifts, one to us and one to CRS, another organization.
And think about that. I mean,
Unbelievable.
just activating these individuals and them rising to the occasion and rising to the moment. They really are. That is, if you can highlight any bright message, that's the one to highlight for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. Sorry.
That was great. It wasn't in the notes in case anyone was wondering. That was fantastic. I picking up on one piece that you said, Fred, is around the narrative side. So education also, a piece of that is the narrative for the sector overall and how we tell the stories of this work. And I think that's something that as a sector we can always get better at, because especially when you're coming into the space, there's a lot of like legacy narratives that exist.
It really is.
And those legacies are not necessarily the most useful ones when it comes to everything we're talking about here. And part of what's interesting in this crisis moment is that it is breaking down some of those narratives and creating a window of rethinking what these roles and systems and the ways of operating look like. And so it's really very encouraging to hear that is having impact on how people are thinking about their own role and what's available to them to meet this moment. So I want to come back over to you, Yanti. As we're thinking about sort of in this space overall, there's also partnership as a big part of what we're talking about. So I'm curious, what unconventional partnerships have been most successful in unlocking new financing models for humanitarian work? I've got another note on here, just like touching also on the innovation side of that.
Well, maybe a couple of examples. I mean, interestingly, this was before you joined Give Directly, actually, Ketan. We started to experiment. So Save the Children also does cash interventions like Give Directly does almost exclusively. And I always felt these Give Directly guys know much more about technology than Save the Children. Why are we not working with them? And we're building it. Everybody's building their own app and their own whatever mobile, platforms to disperse cash, which is in a lot of cases still much more effective than giving people, a service, a product, whatever. In most cases, but it's to your point. It's still about how can we make sure we take the most cost-effective way of doing it and then also scaling it. So in the LA wildfires response that we did here, we actually partnered with Give Directly.
That was with Save the Children.
There you go.
So cool.
And they helped us target, and we said, let's focus on families with children with disabilities because they are completely left out, et cetera, et cetera. So you helped us target those. We had the funding and the cash, and we essentially gave you the cash and the targeting, et cetera. And that was all. And that was an interesting just experiment to say, can we do this? And initially our own cash people said like, no, we can do this ourselves. And yeah, but do we have to? Right? So those are some of the ideas we're thinking about. I'm working quite closely now with CARE and Mercy Corps, already really good peers. As I said, we always like each other. But now we're saying we're going to do a couple of things together. We're going to look at, so local partners on the ground that everybody works with often have to jump through all kinds of hoops to be vetted by us, due diligence. Now, a lot of that was USAID driven, but still, you need to vet partners everywhere. But they all work for all of us. And it's like doing your due diligence like 10 times, slightly differently, but all the time. So why don't we have a common app to do that for a local partner? So then you're vetted by one process, and if it's good enough for one, it's good enough for everybody. That is something we could do. I would love to have technology partners to help us with that, right? To make it even easier and a much faster process for partners, a less daunting process than to give them an 85-page document quite often, instilled by our archaic sort of bureaucracy to do it. So those are some of the ideas we have there. And then we're also looking at innovation like, dare I say it, Bitcoin. We're doing, and when a team said to me, we're doing it in Bhutan, and we're like, oh, well, Bhutan wouldn't have been on my top 3 list, but there we go. We're testing it in Bhutan. We're essentially saying to donors, give us your Bitcoin. We have a platform and a local partner in Bhutan who converts that Bitcoin into cash with an arrangement around hedging and, take the fluctuations out for the recipients. And they work with really youth-led organizations there to pilot it, first and foremost, to see if actually the mechanism works, if the young people are happy with the service, do they, help us understand how this works. Is it easy? Is it effective? And that could be something that's, safe and fast and potentially incredibly efficient. So there are a lot of opportunities here. As always, the thing here is we cannot do 1,000 flowers bloom sort of approach. So let's try to be. So therefore, again, it starts with what do we want to solve? What do we want to be a part of solving in this world and be humble about our role there? And what are we uniquely placed to do better than anybody else?
the collaboration piece is so critical right now. And a quote that has stayed with me from earlier this year was a senior leader in the space calling out the narcissism of small differences.
Oh God, yes.
Wow.
Yeah.
So the small differences you mentioned is maybe a place where some ego lives, and right now is the time to
100%.
let that go.
100%.
And I would bring that back. I think your point about the primary question being, what are we trying to achieve? I think one of the really pernicious effects of both like kind of the competition for public funding, but also this kind of overhead myth has been it perpetuates the idea that it's one organization versus another
Yeah.
in these very kind of limited metrics. And where I think some of the greatest opportunities for partnership are around the idea of comparative advantage.
That's right.
I love being with you on panels because you're an economist. So I can say things.
Spoken like a true
Yes, in a very specific way. Comparative advantage towards achieving specific outcomes. And so, I mean, that applies even in my kind of day job at Give Directly. We are at our core an organization that delivers cash at large scale. And when I was interviewing for the position, I said, so you already know what your intervention is. What do you need a researcher for? What are you going to do with this? But the interesting space there is as we learn about what cash does as a complement to other kinds of intervention. If it's with nutritional counseling, and there's evidence that when you combine cash plus behavior change communication, specific information are targeted in specific ways, you can achieve very difficult to move outcomes, changes in children's stunting, which is a chronic malnutrition condition over a long period of time. So I think, the intersection of like kind of this moment for partnerships based on outcomes, and where we're all trying to figure out what we do towards this shared outcome. As well as the optimism I have from getting to meet some really wonderful people this year who've kind of opened their purses and supported, it has been a remarkable moment of partnership as well in the sector, where there's been more transparency and I think a recognition we're all in this together in a way,
And
less
it brings
of the
back that importance of outcomes, right? And I think, and even in our own boardrooms, we've had to, people would celebrate revenue growth, which is so dangerous. Well, that's dangerous in any industry, as we know so well in this country. But, that is not success, right? Getting in more money. Look, we want to fight for dollars to go to kids or to good causes, not to whatever, more yachts or castles. People want to, I want share of wallet, absolutely. But I don't want to celebrate that we created more revenue. By the way, some of that growth, if you have a huge tsunami, you'll grow revenue. Is that something worth celebrating? I don't think so, right? What we should celebrate is how many kids did we take out of poverty? How many girls are longer in school or out of early child marriage? That is what you should celebrate. And it put the focus back on that. And I also think philanthropy is, in that sense, sometimes better than institutional donors because they are the ones that are really more risk-taking, are willing to put money behind research and more innovative experimental approaches that maybe are not a slam dunk immediately.
And I think that could be, we've talked about comparative advantage among implementing organizations. One thing I feel like I've seen over the last number of years is the organization of the philanthropic sector into kind of purely outcomes focused and maybe risk tolerant early stage funding. One of the wonderful things being in San Francisco is you can talk to people who actually get how like portfolio funding of early stage ideas works. When you're in government, if you say, oh yes, I funded 5 things and 4 of them were a success, you would be like, oh my God, something failed?
Yeah, exactly.
Did you get fired? Like in Congress? But we were saying before we started, like if what you're doing is early stage R&D and you fund 5 things and one of them turns out to be this next, whatever the unicorn of impact is, you have succeeded. And that's something that certain types of private capital can do uniquely well that government historically had a very hard time with.
Yeah. Any government, not just here.
Yeah.
And I would just say, could I just add, if I were to say from our perspective, what can we do in our capacity as sort of the donor advice fund, this sort of financial instrument, if you will, for giving? I mean, I'm looking at my colleagues in the back of the room and I sort of divide them up in what they do. Half of them are focused on strategy and product. So what can we do to ensure that our solution is highly efficient? The technology we use makes the mechanism scalable, low cost, and ultimately enables our donors to get as much to the likes of Save the Children as they possibly can? How can we remain as efficient as possible? And then my other colleague runs strategic partnerships. Who can we partner with in the philanthropic sector to do more around messaging, around education, around, for example, one thing that we're doing is we're entering into a partnership with a really extraordinary academic resource in philanthropy to build a platform specifically for nonprofits and charities to understand how they can engage and activate donors with donor-advised funds. It's just a matter of creating awareness, elevating that visibility. And, it's just heartening to see that I view as our role to play in an effort to try to make up that gap and engage those donors in the most effective way possible to maximize their impact.
Well, this is perfect transition. We're going to be going to questions in a moment, so get ready with your questions. But before that, I have a quick round for all of you, which is, what's one bold idea that you would like the audience to walk away with?
Am I
Yeah,
on
Jen.
first? Okay. They did tell me I had this question in advance, so I had some.
But it was hard to choose.
It was hard to choose, well, and I don't know. I am a person who
yeah.
he said it.
That's very good.
I think one of the bold ideas is actually not overthinking it. Like, I've now worked in the research kind of sector for 15 years. There is another, decades behind that. We have so much evidence on things that do work and that give the opportunity to save lives. And that if people are opening their purses, if they are spending this money that is sitting in these staffs, sometimes to a much greater amount than people even realized. And if they're doing it with this very basic framework of what outcomes are you trying to achieve and what interventions are going to deliver that, we've done the math on some of what we've achieved this year. I think in just one of the Save the Children projects that Pro was able to direct funding towards, the estimate is more than 900 children's lives saved.
Amazing.
That actually was not rocket science. It was like 6 of us with a free Google account and a spreadsheet. The potential for doing this is real, it's there, and it's there right now. So I hope people just kind of grab onto that and don't make it more complicated than it has to be.
I would really sort of double click on that. I say to people constantly, we have to make it simple, not easy, right? This stuff is not easy. To deliver some of these interventions in war-torn parts of Somalia is, sometimes bloody hard. So the implementation science is actually difficult, but the overthinking in capital cities predominantly is really harmful. So my biggest bold idea was, and you will recognize this, we can eradicate child malnutrition in our lifetime. That was not a thing my parents could say, right? Or my grandparents could say, because they were like, well, there's not enough money in the world, there's not enough science in the world, we don't know. We have no excuses for that anymore. We know exactly what causes it, what causes relapse, what can treat it, what can prevent it. And actually, we know also how cost effective these are. For a couple of dollars per month per child, you can completely make that a non-issue. Even if people are poor, in poor countries. I'm not saying let's solve the world and have every country be like Sweden. Yeah, that would be nice. But no, that is not necessary. But 5 million kids still die of preventable causes, starvation being one of them, per year. Now, a lot less than 20 years ago, less than half of 20 years ago, but still 5 million completely unnecessary in a world of plenty.
How do I follow that?
I know.
Gosh, I would say, recognize for donors to recognize their generosity and their generous spirit and what they give, and be more intentional and be more impact focused on how they give. How am I going to really hone in on and define what I want to support, how I want to support it? How am I going to be more focused on the impact that I ultimately want to achieve with my giving? Is it going to be impact in terms of a return? No. Is it going to be impact in terms of how many lives we're going to save? Yes. And how are we going to be able to engage with nonprofits that are going to help deliver that impact in the most effective and scalable way, where we can truly see, a shift and a change in philanthropy going from, well, I'm just giving because it's the right thing to do, because I'm giving because I have a commitment and a responsibility to make that change now. That's what I think would be the bold thing that I would say.
It's powerful. I think similarly, it's not rocket science. I mean, in any space, when you get more clear, that's when action happens.
Right.
And so clarity is a very powerful intervention in this space. So glad you're doing that role. So opening it up to all of you, Frank is going to be bringing around a microphone. Please give us your questions. Yes, raise your hand. We've got one here and one here.
So you all spoke a lot about focusing on what outcomes you want to achieve and the interventions that work the best for that. How do you make sure that you're doing it in the best way in specific places? Like, how do you implement it most effectively depending on the context?
Well, so yes, exactly. That one, exactly. So you always have to adapt to the context, right? So yes, we know what works to prevent child malnutrition or early education, but of course it looks a little different in South Sudan versus DRC versus Indonesia versus Afghanistan. It looks different in specific counties in South Sudan, one versus the other, sometimes in a neighboring space, right? So you work with, essentially you work with the local community, right? The parents, the kids, if they're old enough to, so you work with them to understand, what have they already figured out that works? Because you'll be surprised how often there's already plenty of stuff that works locally that we, have no idea working. So you work with your local staff who are often from that area, from that community. You work with the elders in the community leaders, you work with local partners, and then you figure out, okay, if this works like this here, what are the elements that we must keep to keep the fidelity of the intervention there, right? Because you have to stay true to some of the evidence. We know it sort of works this way based on, tons of years of doing this everywhere. So as local as possible, as global as necessary is sort of the mantra that we're trying to explain, but it all comes down to being very well versed to have those relationships in the community where you want to have that impact. And then at scale, you really have to get to, okay, how do we help the local government to implement the right policies that actually incentivize these interventions? Ideally, find a way to also mobilize those resources locally. The tax revenue is not always there, but in some cases it is. Mm-hmm. Right? So those are some of the adaptations that you then make along the way.
And I think one of the things that has been really exciting, I was at a research conference at UC Berkeley earlier today, and I was reflecting kind of when I started doing this and I did like my first cost effectiveness analysis, it was like, we have like 10 or 12 randomized trials of education. Like, we know so much. It's amazing. And we have like 150 now. The amount that you can know about why things work and why that is different from place to place, both from the experience of local implementation, but also seeing the variations in results. There's no thing that works every single place in the same way. No. And I think we're past the days where we would get one RCT result and say, aha, I bet I get the exact same point estimate of impact in Kenya as I saw in Tanzania, as I will see in Indonesia. We now have 10 studies and we can say, the impact is a little bit higher, a little bit lower. And I think I understand why. Or if I don't, that would be a great subsequent research project. And so I think the kind of frontier of applying evidence now is not this cookie cutter approach that says, this was good, do it everywhere. It either is saying, like, what are the conditions under which? I mean, this is the interesting question for me about cash transfers. Actually, kind of like a failure case where they're pretty good at a lot of things in a lot of places. But we're starting to ask ourselves these frontier questions of, like, these have been really good for asset accumulation and long-term income growth in stable settings. But that's not usually how we do cash transfers in humanitarian settings. No. I think there's a very ripe question there to say, if we did large lump sum transfers of the kind that we've historically done in, Western Kenya, could we help people who are displaced actually accumulate assets and increase their income? We don't know that yet. We don't assume that it applies from one place to the next, but we can do the research. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Next question.
Oh, great. Thank you for the discussion. Sorry, I was late. I had a question for Yanti. I was just curious within the realm of innovative financing and multi-stakeholder partnerships, and whether maybe kind of how the cuts in funding in a lot of places has affected those either positively or negatively, and also maybe a few words about your relationship with the UN, who also has been, who's a big fan of works closely with Save the Children, that has also been affected. So just a few words on that topic would be great.
Right. Look, I think on innovative financing, I do think that was that idea has been around for quite a lot longer. It was around before I even joined the sector, I think. So, but I do think, is it an idea whose time has come to really get more substantive? I would hope so. The fact that we are able to launch, I think, very soon a fund to address early childhood development in Africa, with 100 million, capital leveraged or mobilized out of that would never have come to us in a traditional grant from a philanthropic funder, I think, makes me optimistic about it. Now, again, nothing is there's no cookie cutter approach. How we do it here will not address maybe healthcare issues in Asia and it's certainly not a silver bullet in terms of what is actually needed to really eradicate, systemic poverty in the world. But I do think it has a place now where we can see the benefits, not just because of the dollars that are going to an issue, but also because of the partnerships that are leveraged through it, and the fact that also national governments are thinking, that is actually quite an interesting way, because it also helps my economic development, it helps my local businesses, and actually now I feel even more, this is not a handout, this is helping me do also economic development. And it's a different conversation than with that government. If you, as Save the Children, bring some of those ideas to the table, they're all of a sudden a bit more interested. They listen to you more because it's a more diverse conversation. And all of a sudden, the Ministry of Finance is more interested in what you have to say, not just the Ministry of Education. So that's multi-stakeholder partnership. And the UN, look, it's part of that. We work a lot with the UN. A reform is incredibly necessary, not because of this moment, but because it was necessary for a long, long time. Some of it is happening. I would love to see some of it happening much faster and much bolder. I think that is incredibly difficult in the way that it is set up today. And that is not necessarily the fault of the UN as a bloc, but that is how the world has arranged its systems and institutions since World War II. Are they hit? Absolutely. So we're seeing that ongoing impact. It doesn't impact Save the Children so much from a funding perspective. It does, here or there. But it does. What worries me more than direct funding is that it impacts a lot of public goods that the UN does provide, from safety and security to global supply chain and logistics to something as prosaic as flights to places where there is otherwise no access, right? And that plus really, the Office of the Commissioner for Human Rights ultimately is important to the standards and the norms we have agreed with each other, the value of human rights and children's rights embodied in the UN. If that gets eroded, then I think, and that is at risk now because, those cuts are coming there and they're definitely coming to those types of agencies, more so even than the WFP. That I think should worry all of us because that ultimately erodes democracy.
Yeah. Frank, I think we have one over on the side.
We have time for just one more question here.
Great.
I'm going to get the person in the back here. This young man here. I'll hold it for you.
So I have a question about donor-advised funds. What is something you wish corporate America understood about DAFs in terms of like compensation and incentive alignment for their teams and their people? Because it seems like once you start to do solidly well, there's some strategic advantages that could accelerate capital into these funds.
I think. Did everybody hear the question?
Yeah.
Make sure. I think the operative word and the key there is transparency. People need to understand what we are and what we're not. We are not accounts that represent an institutional approach to how and where to give. We are solutions that are separate from the entities that sponsor us, and we have a separate staff. We have a separate compensation structure. So the answer is, I think, transparency into what we are versus what we're not. And as it relates to staff, I think what we can demonstrate, at least in the case of our solution, DAF Giving 360, our commitment as an organization, as an institution, is to make sure that when $10,000 or $100,000 are given to the likes of Save the Children, or granted to it, they receive $100,000. Our fee structure is comparatively tiny. And all we do, and we are a nonprofit organization with a 990 that fully discloses everything that we have in the way of expenses. What we do is keep those fees down as much as we possibly can, from all perspectives in order to maximize the impact that we have and our donors have on the charities that they choose to support. So I think if I were to answer that question with one word, it would be transparency. Make sure people understand what a donor advised fund is, and more importantly, I think what it's not. And it's messaging. It's something that we've had to contend with for years. People think we're a certain way, we do a certain thing, and it is frankly not at all the case. It's been, you know, a challenge that we've faced for many years, and we continue to chip away at, but it's still there.
Following up a little bit on that, Fred, actually, can you go in to me over here? Sorry.
Oh, sorry. Like, who's talking?
I think maybe one misconception that might be interesting to address here is that it is for a certain level of donor,
Right.
which is not true.
It's really not.
And that, I think, is a really interesting part of DAFs and a real opportunity from an education perspective.
100%. And again, to your point, people think that when they think of a donor advised fund, they think of something that's only for the ultra wealthy.
Yeah.
And that is not at all the case. For example, in our particular case, there's no minimum to open an account. You can open an account with a zero balance. You can open it with $5. And the goal is to streamline and make it more efficient and more sort of a part of your day-to-day giving to charity.
Financial planners, financial planners, I mean, that's like, I've been singing that choir for years, and yeah. In the community foundation, that was it, 25,000 was the minimum, but I'm so happy to hear this.
Exactly. That's exactly right. And
Our world is really where it can start with the younger people.
can you give this lady a mic, please? Really? I'm just kidding. No, I'm sorry. No, but you're 100% correct. It is. We view it as our obligation to make this an accessible vehicle for all people to give. And I might add that, you know, many times we're talking about multi-generations here. So those people that might be younger right now and not necessarily access to the same means of their parents or their grandparents, they will. And the more quickly you establish them and make charitable giving a priority for them, the more it is going to be an intractable part of their future in every walk of life. And that is exactly right.
So many funny conversations. I mean, I can think of an early client, the wife, they were making money, they have small kids, and the husband, I said, what would your dream be? He goes, well, I think I'm a philanthropist. It was so funny because she looked at him like, no, you're not. Because that's a big word, right? It's okay.
I love this
Yeah,
idea
yeah.
because we just opened, my daughter took her wallet with like $100 in savings to the bank this past weekend.
Oh, wow.
And she saved some to donate and some for all of this, but I didn't know it was at $0. So I would have assumed that like
There
my
you go.
6-year-old could not
New
do
DAF-
it. And
new
now
DAF
I
is
know.
coming.
Well, that's exactly right. That's exactly right. And
She will be excited to hear this.
it is exciting. I think
So
it's
I know we
exciting.
have a lot more questions, but unfortunately we have run out of time. So
Right.
I'll hand it back over to Frank. to
I
close
am
us
sorry
out.
about running out of time. I want to thank our panel here today for their brilliance, their information, their ideas. I could go on, but I want to thank you. Remember that you can listen again to this program in a few days on the Commonwealth Club World Affairs website, recording podcast session. And there are a couple of upcoming events also that might be kind of interesting to come back here and attend. We eagerly look forward to your returning during this Commonwealth Club World Affairs 122nd year of Enlight public discussion. And now this meeting is adjourned.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.